Hello and welcome to the latest reading from It Shouldn't Happen to a Vet by James Herriot. And tonight we cover chapters 25 through to 27. So chapter 25. There was one client who would not have been invited to the debtors' cocktail party. He was Mr. Horace Dumbleby, the butcher of Aldgrove. As an inveterate non-payer, he fulfilled the main qualification for the function, but he was singularly lacking in charm. His butcher shop in the main street of picturesque Aldgrove village was busy and prosperous, but most of his trade was done in the neighbouring smaller villages and among the scattered farmhouses of the district. Usually the butcher's wife and married daughter looked after the shop while Mr. Dumbleby himself did the rounds. I often saw his blue van standing with the back doors open and a farmer's wife waiting while he cut the meat, his big shapeless body hunched over the slab. Sometimes he would look up and I would catch a momentary glimpse of a huge bloodhound face and melancholy eyes. Mr. Dumbleby was a farmer himself in a small way. He sold milk from 6 cows which he kept in a tidy little byre behind his shop, and he fattened a few bullocks and pork pigs which later appeared as sausages, pies, roasting cuts and chops in his front window. In fact, Mr. Dumbleby seemed to be very nicely fixed, and it was said he owned property all over the place. But Siegfried had only infrequent glimpses of his money. All the slow payers had one thing in common. They would not tolerate slowness from the vets. When they were in trouble, they demanded immediate action. Will you come at once? How long will you be? You won't keep me waiting, will you? I want you to come out here straight away. It used to alarm me to see the veins swelling on Siegfried's forehead, the knuckles whitening as he gripped the phone. After one such session with Mr. Dumbleby at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, he had flown into a rage and unleashed the full fury of the P&S system on him. It had no loosening effect on the butcher's purse strings, but it did wound his feelings deeply. He obviously considered himself a wronged man. From that time on, whenever I saw him with his van out in the country, he would turn slowly and direct a blank stare at me till I was out of sight. And strangely I seemed to see him more and more often. The thing became unnerving. And there was something worse. Tristan and I used to frequent the little Aldgrove pub, where the bar was cosy and the beer measured up to Tristan's stringent standards. I had never taken much notice of Mr. Dumbleby before, although he always occupied the same corner. But now, every time I looked up, the great sad eyes were trained on me in disapproval. I tried to forget about him and listened to Tristan relating his stories from the backs of envelopes, but all the time I could feel that gaze upon me. My laughter would trail away, and I would have to look round. Then the excellent bitter would be as vinegar in my mouth. In an attempt to escape, I took to visiting the snug instead of the bar, and Tristan, showing true nobility of soul, came with me into an environment which was alien to him, where there was a carpet on the floor, people sitting around at little shiny tables drinking gin, and hardly a pint in sight. But even this sacrifice was in vain, because Mr. Dumbleby changed his position in the bar so that he could look into the snug through the communicating hatch. The odd hours I was able to spend there took on a macabre quality. I was like a man trying desperately to forget, but quaff the beer as I might, laugh, talk, even sing. Half of me was waiting in a state of acute apprehension for the moment when I knew I would have to look round. And when I did, the great sombre face looked even more forbidding, framed by the wooden surround of the hatch. The hanging jowls, the terraced chins, the huge brooding eyes, all were dreadfully magnified by their isolation in that little hole in the wall. It was no good. I had to stop going to the place. This was very sad, because Tristan used to wax lyrical about a certain unique, delicate nuttiness which he could discern in the draught bitter. But it had lost its joy for me. I just couldn't take any more of Mr. Dumbleby. In fact, I did my best to forget all about the gentleman, but he was brought back forcibly into my mind when I heard his voice on the phone at 3 a.m. one morning. It was nearly always the same thing when the bedside phone exploded in your ear in the small hours. A carving. Mr. Dumbleby's call was no exception, but he was more peremptory than might have been expected. There was no question about apologising about ringing at such an hour, as most farmers would do. I said I would come immediately, but that wasn't good enough. He wanted to know exactly in minutes how long I would be. In a sleepy attempt at sarcasm, I started to recite a programme of so many minutes to get up and dressed, so many to go downstairs and get the car out, etc., but I fear it was lost on him. When I drove into the sleeping village, a light was showing in the window of the butcher's shop. Mr. Dumbleby almost trotted out into the street and paced up and down, muttering, as I fished out my ropes and instruments from the boot. Very impatient, I thought, for a man who hadn't paid his vet bill for over a year. We had to go through the shop to get to the bar in the rear. My patient was a big fat white cow that didn't seem particularly perturbed by her situation. Now and then she strained, pushing a pair of feet a few inches from her vulva. I took a keen look at those feet. It is the vet's first indication of how tough the job is going to be. 2 huge hooves, sticking out of a tiny heifer, have always been able to wipe the smile off my face. These feet were big enough, but not out of the way, and in truth, the mother looked sufficiently roomy. I wondered what was stopping the natural sequence. "I've had me hand in," said Mr. Dumbleby. "There's a head there, but I can't shift out. I've been pulling them legs for half an hour." As I stripped to the waist, it was still considered vaguely sissy to wear a carving overall. I reflected that things could be a lot worse. So many of the buildings where I had to take my shirt off were primitive and draughty, but this was a modern cowhouse, and the 6 cows provided a very adequate central heating. And there was electricity in place of the usual smoke-blackened oil lamp. When I had soaped and disinfected my arms, I made my first exploration, and it wasn't difficult to find the cause of the trouble. There was a head and 2 legs all right, but they belonged to different calves. "We've got twins here," I said. "These are hind legs you've been pulling. A posterior presentation." "Arse fust, you mean?" "If you like. And the calf that's coming the right way has both his legs back along his sides. I'll have to push him back out of the way and get the other one out." This was going to be a pretty tight squeeze. Normally I like a twin calving because the calves are usually so small, but these seemed to be quite big. I put my hand against the little muzzle in the passage, poked a finger into the mouth, and was rewarded by a jerk and flip of the tongue. He was alive anyway. I began to push him steadily back into the uterus, wondering at the same time what the little creature was making of it all. He had almost entered the world. His nostrils had been a couple of inches from the outside air, and now he was being returned to the starting post. The cow didn't think much of the idea either, because she started a series of straining heaves with the object of frustrating me. She did a pretty fair job, too, since a cow is a lot stronger than a man, but I kept my arm rigid against the calf, and though each heave forced me back, I maintained a steady pressure till I had pushed him to the brim of the pelvis. I turned to Mr. Dumbleby and gasped, "I've got this head out of the way. Get hold of those feet and pull the other calf out." The butcher stepped forward ponderously, and each of his big meaty hands engulfed a foot. Then he closed his eyes, and with many facial contortions and noises of painful effort, he began to go through the motions of tugging. The calf didn't move an inch, and my spirits drooped. Mr. Dumbleby was a grunter. This expression had its origin in an occasion when Siegfried and a farmer had a foot apiece at a calving, and the farmer was making pitiful sounds without exerting himself in the slightest. Siegfried had turned to him and said, "Look, let's come to an arrangement. You do the pulling, and I'll do the grunting." It was clear I was going to get no help from the big butcher, and I decided to have one go by myself. I might be lucky. I let go the muzzle and made a quick grab for those hind feet, but the cow was too quick for me. I had just got a slippery grasp when she made a single expulsive effort and pushed calf number 2 into the passage again. I was back where I started. Once more I put my hand against the wet little muzzle and began the painful process of repulsion. And as I fought against the big cow's straining, I was reminded that it was 4 a.m, when none of us feels very strong. By the time I had worked the head back to the pelvic inlet, I was feeling the beginning of that deadly creeping weakness, and it seemed as though somebody had removed most of the bones from my arm. This time I took a few seconds to get my breath back before I made my dive for the feet, but it was no good. The cow beat me easily with a beautifully timed contraction. Again that intruding head was jammed tight in the passage. I had had enough, and it occurred to me that the little creature inside must also be getting a little tired of this back and forth business. I shivered my way through the cold, empty shop, out into the silent street, and collected the local anaesthetic from the car. 8 cc's into the epidural space, and the cow, its uterus completely numbed, lost all interest in the proceedings. In fact, she pulled the little hay from her rack and began to chew absently. From then on, it was like working inside a mailbag. Whatever I pushed stayed put instead of surging back at me. The only snag was that once I had got everything straight, there were no uterine contractions to help me. It was a case of pulling. Leaning back on a hind leg and with Mr. Dumbleby panting in agony on the other, the posterior presentation was soon delivered. He had inhaled a fair amount of placental fluid, but I held him upside down until he had coughed it up. When I laid him on the byre floor, he shook his head vigorously and tried to sit up. Then I had to go in after my old friend, the second calf. He was lying well inside now, apparently sulking. When I finally brought him snuffling and kicking into the light, I couldn't have blamed him if he had said, "Make up your mind, will you?" Towel in my chest, I looked with the sharp stab of pleasure I always felt at the 2 wet little animals wriggling on the floor as Mr. Dumbleby rubbed them down with a handful of straw. "Big uns for twins," the butcher muttered. Even this modest expression of approval surprised me, and it seemed I might as well push things along a bit. "Yes, they're 2 grand calves. Twins are often dead when they're mixed up like that. Good job we got them out alive." I paused a moment. "You know, those 2 must be worth a fair bit." Mr. Dumbleby didn't answer, and I couldn't tell whether the shaft had gone home. I got dressed, gathered up my gear, and followed him out of the bar and into the silent shop past the rows of beef cuts hanging from hooks, the trays of offal, the mounds of freshly made sausages. Near the outside door the butcher halted and stood irresolute for a moment. He seemed to be thinking hard. Then he turned to me. "Would you like a few sausages?" I almost reeled in astonishment. "Yes, thank you very much, I would." It was scarcely credible, but I must have touched the man's heart. He went over, cut about a pound of links, wrapped them quickly in greaseproof paper, and handed the parcel to me. I looked down at the sausages, feeling the cold weight on my hand. I still couldn't believe it. Then an unworthy thought welled in my mind. It wasn't fair, I know. The poor fellow couldn't have known the luxury of many generous impulses, but some inner demon drove me to put him to the test. I put a hand in my trouser pocket, jingled my loose change, and looked him in the eye. "Well, how much will that be?" I asked. Mr. Dumbleby's big frame froze suddenly into immobility, and he stood for a few seconds perfectly motionless. His face, as he stared at me, was almost without expression, but a single twitch of the cheek and a slowly rising anguish in the eyes betrayed the internal battle which was raging. When he did speak, it was in a husky whisper, as though the words had been forced from him by a power beyond his control. "That," he said, "will be 2 and 6pence. So chapter 26. It was a new experience for me to be standing outside the hospital, waiting for the nurses to come off duty. But it was old stuff to Tristan, who was to be found there several nights a week. His experience showed in various ways, but mainly in the shrewd position he took up in a dark corner of the doorway of the gas company office, just beyond the splash of light thrown by the street lamp. From there he could look straight across the road into the square entrance of the hospital and the long white corridor leading to the nurses' quarters. And there was the other advantage that if Siegfried should happen to pass that way, Tristan would be invisible and safe. At 7:30 he nudged me. 2 girls had come out of the hospital and down the steps and were standing expectantly in the street. Tristan looked warily in both directions before taking my arm. "Come on, Jim. Here they are. That's Connie on the left, the coppery blonde. Lovely little thing." We went over and Tristan introduced me with characteristic charm. I had to admit that if the evening had indeed been arranged for therapeutic purposes, I was beginning to feel better already. There was something healing in the way the 2 pretty girls looked up at me, with parted lips and shining eyes, as though I was the answer to every prayer they had ever offered. They were remarkably alike, except for the hair. Brenda was very dark, but Connie was fair with a deep fiery glow where the light from the doorway touched her head. Both of them projected a powerful image of bursting health, fresh cheeks, white teeth, lively eyes, and something else which I found particularly easy to take, a simple desire to please. Tristan opened the back door of the car with a flourish. "Be careful with him in there, Connie. He looks quiet, but he's a devil with women, known far and wide as a great lubber." The girls giggled and studied me with even greater interest. Tristan leaped into the driver's seat and we set off at breakneck speed. As the dark countryside hastened past the windows, I leaned back in the corner and listened to Tristan, who was in full cry, maybe in a kindly attempt to cheer me, or maybe because he just felt that way, but his flow of chatter was unceasing. The girls made an ideal audience because they laughed in delight at everything he said. I could feel Connie shaking against me. She was sitting very close with a long stretch of empty seat on the other side of her. The little car swayed round a sharp corner and threw her against me, and she stayed there quite naturally with her head on my shoulder. I felt her hair against my cheek. She didn't use much perfume, but smelt cleanly of soap of antiseptic. My mind went back to Helen. I didn't think much about her these days. It was just a question of practice, to scotch every thought of her as soon as it came up. I was getting pretty good at it now. Anyway, it was over. All over before it had begun. I put my arm round Connie and she lifted her face to me. "Oh, well," I thought as I kissed her. Tristan's voice rose in song from the front seat. Brenda giggled. The old car sped over the rough road with 1,000 rattles. We came at last to Poulton, a village on the road to nowhere. Its single street straggled untidily up the hillside to a dead end where there was a circular green with an ancient stone cross and a steep mound on which was perched the Institute Hall. This was where the dance was to be held, but Tristan had other plans first. "There's a lovely little pub here. We'll just have a toothful to get us in the mood." We got out of the car and Tristan ushered us into a low stone building. There was nothing of the old world about the place, just a large square whitewashed room with a black cooking range enclosing a bright fire and a long high-backed wooden settle facing it. Over the fireplace stretched a single immense beam, gnarled and pitted with the years and blackened with smoke. We hurried over to the settle, feeling the comfort of it as a screen against the cold outside. We had the place to ourselves. The landlord came in. He was dressed informally. No jacket, striped, collarless shirt, trousers and braces, which were reinforced by a broad leather belt around his middle. His cheerful round face lit up at the sight of Tristan. "Now then, Mr. Farnan, are you very well?" "Never better, Mr. Peacock, and how are you?" "Nicely, sir, very nicely. Can't complain. And I recognise the other gentleman. Been in my place before, haven't you?" I remembered then. A day's testing in the Poulton district, and I had come in here for a meal, freezing and half-starved after hours of wrestling with young beasts on the high moor. The landlord had received me unemotionally and had set to immediately with his frying pan on the old black range, while I sat looking at his shirt back and the braces and the shining leather belt. The meal had taken up the whole of the round oak table by the fire, a thick steak of home-cured ham overlapping the plate with 2 fresh eggs nestling on its bosom, a newly baked loaf with the knife sticking in it, a dish of farm butter, some jam, a vast pot of tea, and a whole Wensleydale cheese, circular, snow-white, about 18 inches high. I could remember eating unbelievingly for a long time, and finishing with slice after slice of the moist, delicately flavoured cheese. The entire meal had cost me £0.50. Yes, Mr. Peacock, I have been here before, and if I'm ever starving on a desert island, I'll think of that wonderful meal you gave me. The landlord shrugged. Well, it was nowt much, sir. Just usual stuff. But he looked pleased. That's fine, then, Tristan said impatiently, but we haven't come to eat. We've come for a drink, and Mr. Peacock keeps some of the finest draught magnet in Yorkshire. I'd welcome your opinion on it, Jim. Perhaps you would be kind enough to bring us up 2 pints and 2 halves, Mr. Peacock. I noticed there was no question of asking the girls what they would like to have, but they seemed quite happy with the arrangement. The landlord reappeared from the cellar, puffing slightly. He was carrying a tall, white enamelled jug from which he poured a thin brown stream, varying the height expertly till he had produced a white frothy head on each glass. Tristan raised his pint and looked at it with quiet reverence. He sniffed it carefully, and then took a sip which he retained in his mouth for a few seconds, while his jaw moved rapidly up and down. After swallowing, he smacked his lips a few times, with the utmost solemnity, then closed his eyes and took a deep gulp. He kept his eyes closed for a long time, and when he opened them they were rapturous, as though he had seen a beautiful vision. It's an experience coming here, he whispered. Keeping bear in the wood is a skilful business, but you, Mr. Peacock, are an artist. The landlord inclined his head modestly, and Tristan, raising his glass in salute, drained it with an easy upward motion of the elbow. Little oos of admiration came from the girls, but I saw that they in their turn had little difficulty in emptying their glasses. With an effort I got my own pint down, and the enamel jug was immediately in action again. I was always at a disadvantage in the company of a virtuoso like Tristan, but as the time passed and the landlord kept revisiting the cellar with his jug, it seemed to become easier. In fact, a long time later, as I drew confidently on my 8th pint, I wondered why I had ever had difficulty with large amounts of fluid. It was easy, and it soothed and comforted. Tristan was right. I had been needing this. It puzzled me that I hadn't realised until now that Connie was one of the most beautiful creatures I had ever seen. Back there in the street outside the hospital, she had seemed attractive, but obviously the light had been bad, and I had failed to notice the perfection of her skin, the mysterious greenish depths of her eyes, and the wonderful hair-catching lights of gold and deep red bronze from the flickering fire, and the laughing mouth, shining, even teeth, and little pink tongue. She hardly ever stopped laughing except to drink her beer. Everything I said was witty, brilliantly funny, in fact, and she looked at me all the time, peeping over the top of her glass in open admiration. It was profoundly reassuring. As the beer flowed, time slowed down, and finally lurched to a halt, and there was neither past nor future, only Connie's face and the warm, untroubled present. I was surprised when Tristan pulled at my arm. I had forgotten he was there, and when I focused on him, it was the same as with Connie. There was just the face swimming disembodied in an empty room, only the face was very red and puffy and glass-eyed. "Would you care for the mad conductor?" the face said. I was deeply touched. Here was another sign of my friend's concern for me. Of all Tristan's repertoire, his imitation of a mad conductor was the most exacting. It involved tremendous expenditure of energy, and since Tristan was unused to any form of physical activity, it really took it out of him. Yet here he was, ready and willing to sacrifice himself. A wave of treacly sentiment flooded through me, and I wondered for a second if it might not be the proper thing to burst into tears, but instead I contented myself with wringing Tristan's hand. "There's nothing I would like more, my dear old chap," I said thickly. "I greatly appreciate the kind thought, and may I take this opportunity of telling you that I consider that in all Yorkshire there is no finer gentleman breathing than T. Farnan." The big red face grew very solemn. "You honour me with those words, old friend." "Not a bit of it," I slurred. "My stumbling sentences cannot hope to express my extremely high opinion of you." "You are too kind," hiccuped Tristan. "Nothing of the sort. It's a privilege, a rare privilege, to know you." Thank you. Tristan nodded gravely at me from a distance of about 6 inches. We were staring into each other's eyes with intense absorption, and the conversation might have gone on for a long time if Brenda hadn't broken in. "Hey, when you two have finished rubbing noses, I'd rather like another drink." Tristan gave her a cold look. "You'll have to wait just a few minutes. There's something I have to do." He rose, shook himself, and walked with dignity to the centre of the floor. When he turned to face his audience, he looked exalted. I felt that this would be an outstanding performance. Tristan raised his arms and gazed imperiously over his imaginary orchestra, taking in the packed rows of strings, the woodwind, brass, and timpani in one sweeping glance. Then, with a violent downswing, he led them into the overture. Rossini this time, I thought, or maybe Wagner, as I watched him throwing his head about, bringing in the violins with a waving clenched fist, or exhorting the trumpets with a glare and a trembling outstretched hand. It was somewhere near the middle of the piece that the rot always set in, and I watched enthralled as the face began to twitch and the lips to snarl. The arm waving became more and more convulsive, then the whole body jerked with uncontrollable spasms. It was clear that the end was near. Tristan's eyes were rolling, his hair hung over his face, and he had lost control of the music, which crashed and billowed about him. Suddenly he grew rigid. His arms fell to his sides, and he crashed to the floor. I was joining in the applause and laughter when I noticed that Tristan was very still. I bent over him and found that he had struck his head against the heavy oak leg of the settle and was almost unconscious. The nurses went quickly into action. Brenda expertly propped up his head, while Connie ran for a basin of hot water and a cloth. When he opened his eyes, they were bathing a tender lump above his ear. Mr. Peacock hovered anxiously in the background. "Is it all right? Can I do anything?" Tristan sat up and sipped weakly at his beer. He was very pale. "I'll be all right in a minute, and there is something you can do. You can bring us one for the road, and then we must be getting on to this dance." The landlord hurried away and returned with the enamel jug brimming. The final pint revived Tristan miraculously, and he was soon on his feet. Then we shook hands affectionately with Mr. Peacock and took our leave. After the brightness of the inn, the darkness pressed on us like a blanket, and we groped our way up the steep street till we could see the Institute standing on its grassy mound. Faint rays of light escaped through the chinks in the curtained windows, and we could hear the music and a rhythmic thudding. A cheerful young farmer took our money at the door, and when we went into the hall we were swallowed up in a tight mass of dancers. The place was packed solidly with young men in stiff-looking dark suits and girls in bright dresses, all sweating happily as they swayed and wheeled to the music. On the low platform at one end, 4 musicians were playing their hearts out: piano, accordion, violin and drums. At the other end, several comfortable middle-aged women stood behind a long table on trestles, presiding over the thick sandwiches of ham and brawn, homemade pies, jugs of milk, and trifles generously laid with cream. All round the walls more lads were standing, eyeing the unattached girls. I recognised a young client. "What do you call this dance?" I yelled above the gym. "Heave a free step," came back the reply. This was new to me, but I launched out confidently with Connie. There was a lot of twirling and stamping, and when the men brought their heavy boots down on the boards, the hall shook and the noise was deafening. I loved it. I was right on the peak, and I whirled Connie effortlessly among the throng. I was dimly aware of bumping people with my shoulders, but try as I might, I couldn't feel my feet touching the floor. The floating sensation was delicious. I decided that I had never been so happy in my life. After half a dozen dances, I felt ravenous and floated with Connie towards the food table. We each ate an enormous wedge of ham and egg pie, which was so exquisite that we had the same again. Then we had some trifle and plunged again into the crush. It was about halfway through a St. Bernard's waltz that I began to feel my feet on the boards again, quite heavy and dragging somewhat. Connie felt heavy too. She seemed to be slumped in my arms. She looked up. Her face was very white. "Just feeling a bit queer. Excuse me." She broke away and began to tack erratically towards the ladies' room. A few minutes later she came out, and her face was no longer white, it was green. She staggered over to me. "Could do with some fresh air. Take me outside." I took her out into the darkness, and it was as if I had stepped aboard a ship. The ground pitched and heaved under my feet, and I had to straddle my legs to stay upright. Holding Connie's arm, I retreated hastily to the wall of the institute and leaned my back against it. This didn't help a great deal, because the wall too was heaving about. Waves of nausea swept over me. I thought of the ham and egg pie and groaned loudly. Open-mouthed, gulping in the sharp air, I looked up at the clean, austere sweep of the night sky and at the ragged clouds driving across the cold face of the moon. "Oh, God!" I moaned at the unheeding stars. "Why did I drink all that bloody beer?" But I had to look after Connie. I put my arm round her. "Come on, we'd better start walking." We began to reel blindly round the building, pausing after 2 or 3 circuits while I got my breath back and shook my head violently to try to clear my brain. But our course was erratic, and I forgot that the institute was perched on a little steep-sided hill. There was an instant when we were treading on nothing, then we were sprawling down a muddy bank. We finished in a tangled heap on the hard road at the bottom. I lay there peacefully till I heard a pitiful whimpering nearby. Connie! Probably a compound fracture at least. When I helped her up, I found she was unhurt, and so, surprisingly, was I. After our large intake of alcohol, we must have been as relaxed as rag dolls when we fell. We went back into the institute and stood just inside the door. Connie was unrecognisable. Her beautiful hair hung across her face in straggling wisps, her eyes were vacant, and tears coursed slowly through the muddy smears on her cheeks. My suit was plastered with clay, and I could feel more of it drying on one side of my face. We stood close, leaning miserably on each other in the doorway. The dancers were a shapeless blur. My stomach heaved and tossed. Then I heard somebody say, "Good evening." "Good evening." It was a woman's voice and very close. There were 2 figures looking at us with interest. They seemed to have just come through the door. I concentrated fiercely on them, and they swam into focus for a few seconds. It was Helen and a man. His pink scrub-looking face, the shining fair hair plastered sideways across the top of his head, were in keeping with the spotless British warm overcoat. He was staring at me distastefully. They went out of focus again, and there was only Helen's voice. "We thought we would just look in for a few moments to see how the dance was going. Are you enjoying it?" Then, unexpectedly, I could see her clearly. She was smiling her kind smile, but her eyes were strained as she looked from me to Connie and back again. I couldn't speak, but stood gazing at her dully, seeing only her calm beauty in the crush and noise. It seemed for a moment that it would be the most natural thing in the world to throw my arms around her, but I discarded the idea and instead just nodded stupidly. "Well then, we must be off," she said, and smiled again. "Good night." The fair-haired man gave me a cold nod, and they went out. Chapter 27. It looked as though I was going to make it back to the road all right. and I was thankful for it, because 7 o'clock in the morning, with the wintry dawn only just beginning to lighten the eastern rim of the moor, was no time to be digging my car out of the snow. This narrow, unfenced road skirted a high tableland and gave on to a few lonely farms at the end of even narrower tracks. It hadn't actually been snowing on my way out to this early call, a uterine hemorrhage and a cow, but the wind had been rising steadily and whipping the top surface from the white blanket which had covered the fell tops for weeks. My headlights had picked out the creeping drifts, pretty pointed fingers feeling their way inch by inch across the strip of tarmac. This was how all blocked roads began, and at the farm, as I injected pituitrin and packed the bleeding cervix with a clean sheet, I could hear the wind buffeting the byre door and wondered if I would win the race home. On the way back, the drifts had stopped being pretty and lay across the road like white bolsters, but my little car had managed to cleave through them, veering crazily at times, wheels spinning, and now I could see the main road a few hundred yards ahead, reassuringly black in the pale light. But just over there on the left, a field away, was Cote House. I was treating a bullock there. He had eaten some frozen turnips, and a visit was fixed for today. I didn't fancy trailing back up here if I could avoid it, and there was a light in the kitchen window. The family were up anyway. I turned and drove down into the yard. The farmhouse door lay within a small porch, and the wind had driven the snow inside, forming a smooth 2-foot heap against the timbers. As I leaned across to knock, the surface of the heap trembled a little, then began to heave. There was something in there, something quite big. It was eerie, standing in the half-light, watching the snow parting to reveal a furry body. Some creature of the wild must have strayed in, searching for warmth, but it was bigger than a fox or anything else I could think of. Just then the door opened and the light from the kitchen streamed out. Peter Trenholm beckoned me inside, and his wife smiled at me from the bright interior. They were a cheerful young couple. "What's that?" I gasped, pointing at the animal, which was shaking the snow vigorously from its coat. "That?" Peter grinned. "That's old Tip." "Tip? Your dog? Well, what's he doing under a pile of snow? I just blew in on him, I reckon. That's where he sleeps, you know, just outside back door." I stared at the farmer. "You mean he sleeps there? Out in the open every night?" "Aye, always. Summer and winter. But don't look at me like that, Mr. Herriot. It's his own choice. The other dogs have a warm bed in the cow-house, but Tip won't entertain it. He's 15 now, and he's been sleeping out there since he were a pup. I remember when me father was alive. He tried all ways to get old fella to sleep inside, but it was no good." I looked at the old dog in amazement. I could see him more clearly now. He wasn't the typical sheepdog type. He was bigger boned, longer in the hair, and he projected a burst in vitality that didn't go with his 15 years. It was difficult to believe that any animal living in these bleak uplands should choose to sleep outside and thrive on it. I had to look closely to see any sign of his great age. There was the slightest stiffness in his gait as he moved around, perhaps a fleshless look about his head and face, and of course the telltale lens opacity in the depths of his eyes. But the general impression was of an unquenchable jauntiness. He shook the last of the snow from his coat, pranced jerkily up to the farmer, and gave a couple of reedy barks. Peter Trenholm laughed. "You see, he's ready to be off. He's a beggar for work, is Tip." He led the way towards the buildings, and I followed, stumbling over the frozen ruts like iron under the snow, and bending my head against the knife-like wind. It was a relief to open the byre door and escape into the sweet bovine warmth. There was a fair mixture of animals in the long building. The dairy cows took up most of the length, then there were a few young heifers, some bullocks, and finally, in an empty stall deeply bedded with straw, the other farm dogs. The cats were there too, so it had to be warm. No animal is a better judge of comfort than a cat, and they were just visible as furry balls in the straw. They had the best place, up against the wooden partition where the warmth came through from the big animals. Tip strode confidently among his colleagues, a young dog and a bitch with 3 half-grown pups. You could see he was boss. One of the bullocks was my patient, and he was looking a bit better. When I had seen him yesterday, his rumen, the big first stomach, had been completely static and atonic following an over-eager consumption of frozen turnips. He had been slightly bloated and groaning with discomfort, but today, as I leaned with my ear against his left side, I could hear the beginnings of the surge and rumble of the normal rumen instead of the deathly silence of yesterday. My gastric ravage had undoubtedly tickled things up, and I felt that another of the same would just about put him right. Almost lovingly, I got together the ingredients of one of my favourite treatments, long since washed away in the flood of progress: the ounce of formalin, the half-pound of common salt, the can of black treacle from the barrel, which you used to find in most cowhouses, all mixed up in a bucket with 2 gallons of hot water. I jammed the wooden gag into the bullock's mouth and buckled it behind the horns. Then, as Peter held the handles, I passed the stomach tube down into the rumen and pumped in the mixture. When I had finished, the bullock opened his eyes even, wide in surprise, and began to paddle his hind legs. Listening again at his side, I could hear the reassuring bubbling of the stomach contents. I smiled to myself in satisfaction. It worked. It always worked. Wiping down the tube, I could hear the hiss-hiss as Peter's brother got on with the morning's milking, and as I prepared to leave, he came down the bar with a full bucket on the way to the cooler. As he passed the dog's stall, he tipped a few pints of the warm milk into their dishes, and Tip strolled forward casually for his breakfast. While he was drinking, the young dog tried to push his way in, but a soundless snap from Tip's jaws missed his nose by a fraction, and he retired to another dish. I noticed, however, that the old dog made no protest as the bitch and pups joined him. The cats, black and white tortoiseshell, tabby grey, appeared, stretching from the straw, and advanced in a watchful ring. Their turn would come. Mrs. Trenholm called me in for a cup of tea, and when I came out it was full daylight. But the sky was a burdened grey, and the sparse trees near the house strained their bare branches against the wind, which drove in long, icy gusts over the white, empty miles of moor. It was what the Yorkshiremen called a fin wind, or sometimes a lazy wind, the kind that couldn't be bothered to blow round you but went straight through instead. It made me feel that the best place on earth was by the side of that bright fire in the farmhouse kitchen. Most people would have felt like that, but not old Tip. He was capering around as Peter loaded a flat cart with some hay bales for the young cattle in the outside barns, and as Peter shook the reins and the cob set off over the fields, he leapt on to the back of the cart. As I threw my tackle into the boot, I looked back at the old dog, legs braced against the uneven motion, tail waving, barking defiance at the cold wind. I carried away the memory of Tip, who scorned the softer things, and slept in what he considered the place of honour, at his master's door. A little incident like this has always been able to brighten my day, and fortunately I have the kind of job where things of this kind happened, and sometimes it isn't even a happening, just a single luminous phrase. When I was examining a cow one morning while its neighbour was being milked, the milker was an old man and he was having trouble. He was sitting well into the cow, his cloth-capped head buried in her flank, the bucket gripped tightly between his knees, but the stool kept rocking about as the cow fidgeted and weaved. Twice she kicked the bucket over, and she had an additional little trick of anointing her tail with particularly liquid faces, then lashing the old man across the face with it. Finally he could stand it no longer. Leaping to his feet, he dealt a puny blow at the cow's craggy back and emitted an exasperated shout. "Stand still, thou shitting old bovril!" Or the day when I had to visit Luke Benson at his small holding in Hillom village. Luke was a powerful man of about 60 and had the unusual characteristic of speaking always through his clenched teeth. He literally articulated every word by moving only his lips, showing the rows of square horse-like incisors clamped tightly together. Like that. It lent a peculiar intensity to his simplest utterance, and as he spoke his eyes glared. Most of his conversation consisted of scathing remarks about the other inhabitants of Hillam. In fact, he seemed to harbour a cordial dislike of the human race in general. Yet, strangely enough, I found him a very reasonable man to deal with. He accepted my diagnoses of his animal's ailments without question, and appeared to be trying to be friendly by addressing me repeatedly as Gems, which was the nearest he could get to my name with his teeth together. Gems. His fiercest hatred was reserved for his neighbour and fellow smallholder, a little lame man called Gill, to whom Luke referred invariably and unkindly as yon hopping youth. A bitter feud had raged between them for many years, and I had seen Luke smile on only 2 occasions, one when Mr. Gill's sow lost its litter, and again when he had a stack burnt down. When Mr. Gill's wife ran away with a man who came round the farms selling brushes, it caused a sensation. Nothing like that had ever happened in Hillam before, and a wave of delighted horror swept through the village. This, I thought, would be the high point of Luke Benson's life, and when I had to visit a heifer of his, I expected to find him jubilant, but Luke was gloomy. As I examined and treated his animal, he remained silent, and it wasn't until I went into the kitchen to wash my hands that he spoke. He glanced round warily at his wife, a gaunt, grim-faced woman who was applying black lead to the grate. "You'll have heard about yon hopping youth's missus running off?" he said. "Yes," I replied, "I did hear about it." I waited for Luke to gloat, but he seemed strangely ill at ease. He fidgeted until I had finished drying my hands, then he glared at me and bared his strong teeth. "I'll tell you something, gents," he ground out. "I wish somebody would take my bugger." And there was that letter from the Bramleys. That really made me feel good. You don't find people like the Bramleys now. Radio, television and the motor car have carried the outside world into the most isolated places, so that the simple people you used to meet on the lonely farms are rapidly becoming like people anywhere else. There are still a few left, of course, old folk who cling to the ways of their fathers, and when I come across any of them, I like to make some excuse to sit down and talk with them and listen to the old Yorkshire words and expressions which have almost disappeared. But even in the 30s, when there were many places still untouched by the flood of progress, the Bramleys were in some ways unique. There were 4 of them, 3 brothers, all middle-aged bachelors, and an older sister, also unmarried, and their farm lay in a wide, shallow depression in the hills. You could just see the ancient tiles of Scar House through the top branches of the sheltering trees if you stood outside the pub in Drewburn village, and in the summer it was possible to drive down over the fields to the farm. I had done it a few times, the bottles in the boot jingling and crashing as the car bounced over the Riggin furrow. The other approach to the place was right on the other side, through Mr. Broom's stackyard, and then along a track with ruts so deep that only a tractor could negotiate it. There was, in fact, no road to the farm, but that didn't bother the Bramleys because the outside world held no great attraction for them. Miss Bramley made occasional trips to Darrowby on market days for provisions, and Herbert, the middle brother, had come into town in the spring of 1929 to have a tooth out, but apart from that they stayed contentedly at home. A call to Scar House always came as rather a jolt because it meant that at least 2 hours had been removed from the working day. In all but the driest weather it was safer to leave the car at Mr. Broom's and make the journey on foot. One February night at about 8 o'clock I was splashing my way along the track, feeling the mud sucking at my Wellingtons. It was to see a horse with colic, and my pockets were stuffed with the things I might need. Aracolin, phials of morphia, a bottle of paraphyroxia. My eyes were half closed against the steady drizzle, but about half a mile ahead I could see the lights of the house winking among the trees. After 20 minutes of slithering in and out of the unseen puddles and opening a series of broken string-tied gates, I reached the farmyard and crossed over to the back door. I was about to knock when I stopped with my hand poised. I found I was looking through the kitchen window, and in the interior, dimly lit by an oil lamp, the Bramleys were sitting in a row. They weren't grouped round the fire, but were jammed tightly on a long, high-backed wooden settle which stood against the far wall. The strange thing was the almost exact similarity of their attitudes. All four had their arms folded, chins resting on their chests, feet stretched out in front of them. The men had removed their heavy boots and were stocking-footed, but Miss Bramley wore an old pair of carpet slippers. I stared, fascinated by the curious immobility of the group. They were not asleep, not talking or reading or listening to the radio. In fact, they didn't have one. They were just sitting. I had never seen people just sitting before, and I stood there for some minutes to see if they would make a move or do anything at all, but nothing happened. It occurred to me that this was probably a typical evening. They worked hard all day, had their meal, then they just sat till bedtime. A month or two later, I discovered another unsuspected side of the Bramleys when they started having trouble with their cats. I knew they were fond of cats by the number and variety which swarmed over the place and perched confidently on my car bonnet on cold days, with their unerring instinct for a warm place. But I was unprepared for the family's utter desolation when the cats started to die. Miss Bramley was on the doorstep at Skeldale House nearly every day, carrying an egg basket with another pitiable patient, a cat or sometimes a few tiny kittens, huddling miserably inside. Even today, with the full range of modern antibiotics, the treatment of feline enteritis is unrewarding, and I had little success with my salicylates and non-specific injections. I did my best. I even took some of the cats in and kept them at the surgery so that I could attend them several times a day, but the mortality rate was high. The Bramleys were stricken as they saw their cats diminishing. I was surprised at their grief because most farmers look on cats as pest killers and nothing more. But when Miss Bramley came in one morning with a fresh consignment of invalids, she was in a sorry state. She stared at me across the surgery table, and her rough fingers clasped and unclasped on the handle of the egg basket. "Is it going to go for 'em all?" she quavered. "Well, it's very infectious, and it looks as though most of your young cats will get it anyway." For a moment Miss Bramley seemed to be struggling with herself. Then her chin began to jerk and her whole face twitched uncontrollably. She didn't actually break down, but her eyes brimmed, and a couple of tears wandered among the network of wrinkles on her cheeks. I looked at her helplessly as she stood there, wisps of grey hair straggling untidily from under the incongruous black beret which she wore pulled tightly over her ears. "It's Topsy's kittens I'm worried about," she gasped out at length. "There's 5 of them, and they're the best we've got." I rubbed my chin. I had heard a lot about Topsy, one of a strain of incomparable ratters and mousers. Her last family were only about 10 weeks old, and it would be a crushing blow to the Bramleys if anything happened to them. But what the devil could I do? There was as yet no protective vaccine against the disease. Or, wait a minute, was there? I remembered that I'd heard a rumour that Burroughs' Wellcome were working on one. I pulled out a chair. "Just sit down a few minutes, Miss Bramley. I'm going to make a phone call." I was soon through to the Wellcome laboratory, and half expected a sarcastic reply, but they were kind and cooperative. They had had encouraging results with the new vaccine, and would be glad to let me have 5 doses if I would inform them of the result. I hurried back to Miss Bramley. "I've ordered something for your kittens. I can't guarantee anything, but there's nothing else to do. Have them down here on Tuesday morning." The vaccine arrived promptly, and as I injected the tiny creatures, Miss Bramley extolled the virtues of the Topsy line. "Look at the size of them ears. Did you ever see bigger uns on kittens? I had to admit that I hadn't. Their ears were enormous, sail-like, and they made the ravishingly pretty little faces look even smaller. Miss Bramley nodded and smiled with satisfaction. Aye, you can always tell. It's the sure sign of a good mouser. The injection was repeated a week later. The kittens were still looking well. Well, that's it, I said. We'll just have to wait now. But remember, I want to know the outcome of this, so please don't forget to let me know. I didn't hear from the Bramleys for several months, and had almost forgotten about the little experiment when I came upon a grubby envelope which had apparently been pushed under the surgery door. It was the promised report, and was, in its way, a model of conciseness. It communicated all the information I required without frills or verbiage. It was in a careful, spridery scrawl, and said simply, Dear Sir, them kittens is now big cats. Yours truly, R. Bramley.